The most terrifying serial killers in history. Pedro Alonso Lopez, known as the Andean Monster, is a notorious serial killer from the 1970s to 1980s. Lopez raped and murdered over 300 young girls in South America, primarily in Peru and Colombia. Lopez would corner his victims in secluded areas and abandoned buildings, strangling them before committing sexual assault. In a January 1999 interview, the killer described himself as the man of the century and argued that he should be released from prison due to his good behavior. Dr. Harold Shipman, the killer beyond all suspicion. Harold Shipman, an English doctor, was proven responsible for the deaths of 250 people between 1971 and 1998. It was determined that Dr. Harold Shipman killed his patients with high doses of morphine. He is documented as the most prolific serial killer in history after Pedro Lopez. Shipman made his mark in British history by being included in the Great and Good page of the Oxford Encyclopedia, sharing the same page with Winston Churchill. Dr. Harold Shipman was sentenced to life imprisonment 15 times in his case on January 13, 2004. He committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell. Daniel Camargo Barboza. Colombian Camargo is a serial killer known for raping and killing nearly 150 young girls around Colombia and Ecuador in the 1970s and 1980s. After Daniel Camargo raped his victims, he cut them with a machete. He was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to only 16 years in prison. Daniel Camargo was killed in prison in November 1994 by the cousin of one of his victims, Pedro Rodrigues Pedrinho Matador. Pedro Rodrigues Filho is a Brazilian serial killer. He was arrested in 1973 and later found guilty in 2003 of killing at least 71 people. He was sentenced to 128 years in prison. Filho committed his first murder and robbery at the age of 14. By the time he turned 18, he had killed 10 people. Initially sentenced to only 30 years in prison, Filho received an additional for 100 years for his continued murders. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway is one of the most terrifying serial killers in the United States, confessing to killing at least 70 women in the state of Washington between the 1980s and 1990s. Ridgway was arrested in 2001 for 49 of these murders, and his detailed confession spared him from the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Andrei Chikatilo, the Rostov Ripper. Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Rostov Ripper, was a Soviet serial killer. He was convicted of sexual assault and the murders of primarily children, totaling 56 victims between 1978 and 1990 in Russia. In April 1992, Chikatilo confessed to 52 of these murders. He was executed by firing squad with a single bullet to the head on February 14, 1994. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. John Wayne Gacy, a homosexual serial killer, murdered 33 young men in Chicago, Illinois between 1972 and 1978. His nickname, the Killer Clown, stemmed from Gacy's respectable job as a businessman and his habit of dressing up as a clown to entertain children in hospitals during his spare time. However, it later became apparent that he lured his victims to his home under the guise of offering them work and a promising future, only to trap and kill them. Prior to disposing of his last victim in the Des Plaines River, Gacy had buried the bodies of his victims under his house. Convicted of 33 murders, Gacy was sentenced to death. He was executed via lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Tommy Lynn Sells, who is claimed to have killed at least 70 people, is considered one of the most dangerous criminals in Texas, United States. Between 1985 and 1999, Sells murdered his victims in extremely brutal ways. Despite stabbing a 10-year-old girl in her bedroom, he failed to kill her, and the girl managed to survive. The young girl provided detailed information to the police, leading to Sells' capture. After being apprehended, Sells was executed in a high-security prison in Texas. Charles Ng and his accomplice Leonard Lake committed between 11 to 25 murders in Calaveras County, California. This Chinese-American duo serial killers subjected their victims to rape and torture, and they also recorded their murders on videotape. Ng was identified as a criminal in 1985 when he was caught shoplifting at a hardware store with Lake. When the police searched for Lake, they discovered the remains of the victims. Lake attempted to flee to Canada, but, upon being apprehended, ingested a cyanide capsule he had with him and killed himself. Ng, on the other hand, awaits execution at San Quentin State Prison, where he was sentenced in 1999. Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious killers of the 20th century, was accused of raping and murdering numerous young women and girls in America. Bundy would often approach his female victims in public places, lure them to secluded areas, and then rape and murder them. Some he would kill. After assaulting them, he kept the severed heads of at least 12 of his victims as trophies in his apartment. Despite being captured multiple times, Bundy managed to escape from police custody and evade capture twice after being charged with murder. Eventually, Bundy was apprehended and confessed to committing more than 30 murders. He was executed in the electric chair in 1989. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel.